for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Given the government has ruled out changes to the legislated increase to the superannuation guarantee, making superannuation voluntary and including the family home in the pension assets test, what is the Prime Minister's response to the many members of his government still campaigning for those very policies?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the Treasurer reminded the House yesterday, and I made it very clear in the lead-up to the last election, our policy on those matters is unchanged. And, Mr Speaker,
members on the left.
What I also know is unchanged is the fact that the Labor Party have a policy for $34 billion of extra taxes on superannuation. They also have a policy that continues to strip away the dividend imputation credits for retirees, Mr Speaker. That remains their policy.
Member for Isaacs.
They continue to pursue these matters of policy as fixed items on the Labor agenda. And we know why. Because Labor are always for higher taxes, Mr Speaker.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it goes to relevance. The question was about the government policies, the government's backbench,
the Leader of the
not
Opposition
about the Labor
resume his seat. There are a number of questions. There was more than a number of components to the question, I should say. And as I've said before, as much as anyone asking the question wants the Minister or the Prime Minister to answer it in a particular way, he is on the policy topic. So, Prime Minister is in order. He'll continue.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Labor are for higher taxes. And I'll tell you why. It's because they don't know how to control spending either.
Member for Isaacs.
They went to the 2016 election and were not voted in because their deficits were too big. And at the 2019 election, they were not voted in because their taxes were too big, Mr Speaker. And the reason is consistent. Labor cannot manage money. That means Labor will be always for higher taxes and bigger deficits, Mr Speaker. That's why they cannot be trusted with the management of our economy, and that's why Australians who depend on the essential services that depend on a stronger economy can never rely on Labor.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question goes to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the minister inform the House whether militant unionism has impacted the occupational health and safety of workers in my electorate of Fairfax and in Queensland more generally?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question. And as the member is aware, the Ensuring Integrity Bill is designed to see that our courts have the ability to ensure lawful behaviour on Australian worksites. It is a bill that will apply equally to employer as well as employee organisations. And there are a number of reasons why this bill is critical and why maintaining lawful conduct on workplaces is critical. Unlawful conduct adds to the costs of infrastructure that is borne by the Australian taxpayer, and one of the very important reasons that unlawful behaviour on worksites that it must be stopped is it puts the safety of workers at risk. Now, we know that the CFMEU has racked up $16 million in court fines for unlawful behaviour for over 2,000 breaches. What is less well known is that many of those breaches actually relate themselves to violations of occupational health and safety standards. And last year, Mr Speaker, the full federal court found that a CFMEU official had acted in an improper manner to a Victorian government occupational health and safety officer. The grotesque behaviour of the CFMEU to that official is not behaviour directed at another worker or an employer, but at a safety official. Now, when we look at Queensland, there are proceedings that were commenced in December of last year against a CFMEU organiser for his behaviour towards a Queensland Government occupational health and safety inspector. The construction site was Cairns Performing Arts Centre. The safety inspector was in the course of inspecting exit signage. He was confronted by the CFMEU official who, within centimetres of the face of the safety officer, said, "You are a effing dog." Not once, not twice, but 3 times. And the upshot of all of this, Mr Speaker—
if the minister could just pause. I'm just going to make a point I've had to make before about a year ago. I appreciate the minister is seeking to the member for Gellibrand and the. Let me just say this. Unparliamentary language cannot be introduced by way of a quote. It's quite clear in practice, and I just caution all members, when they're even abbreviating a quote, to just be mindful of the audience.
Indeed, no one should have to put up with that language in their workplace. No one. And the Queensland Public Sector Union now, has a list of 17 sites that they will not let their members, their safety inspectors, visit because, and I'm quoting from that union, work at the locations are deemed unsafe by the State Secretary due to the likely presence of individuals or organisation whose behaviour is deemed a risk to members' workplace health and safety. The Public Sector Union representing safety inspectors in Queensland will not allow its members to go to workplaces because of abuse by the CFMEU because it is unsafe. This is the quote from the website of the Public Sector Union. Inspectors will not attend sites to resolve right of entry issues under the Work Health and Safety Act where there is a risk of occupational violence. And yet the Labor Party's national executive includes the CFMEU Queensland Secretary as its member.
The member for Rankin.
Thanks very much, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When will the Prime Minister cave into pressure from members of his government on changing the legislated increase to the super guarantee, making super voluntary and including the family home in the pension assets test, just like he did on the National Energy Guarantee?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, we've had 44 questions from those opposite, and the Shadow Treasurer hasn't asked one of the Treasurer, Mr Speaker. Not interested in the economy. Not interested in the economy. Now, we dealt with that issue yesterday, but as the Prime Minister has told the House, there's only one side of this place that is promising $34 billion of higher taxes, and it's those opposite, Mr Speaker. $34 billion of higher taxes. And those opposite, when it comes to superannuation, want to ban the catch-up contributions, Mr Speaker. So if you're a mother who's a teacher or a nurse, and you want to take 4 years out of the workforce to raise a child or look after a sick relative, and you want to make a catch-up contribution, the Labor Party won't let you, Mr Speaker. 230,000 Australians will be affected by that. And if you're a 30-year-old worker in the workforce today and you take 4 years off and you want to make a catch-up contribution, as a result of Labor's policy, you will be more than $300,000 worse off in retirement, Mr Speaker. The fact of the matter is we're for lower taxes and Labor is for higher taxes, particularly on superannuation.
The member for Bowman.
Thanks, Speaker. My question to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Minister inform the House of the contributions made by militant unions to political parties in recent years? Is the Minister concerned that law-breaking unions are funding the activities of political parties?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And as the member is aware, the Ensuring Integrity Bill would allow for a court to make a finding, for instance, that a person was not a fit and proper person to be a public official. For a union or indeed for an employer association, the bill applies to both instances. The court might make that decision that someone's not a fit and proper person, for instance, because they had a significant history of breaking the law in Australia, the civil law or the criminal law, especially criminal laws punishable by 2 years or more imprisonment. And why is that important? Of course, because unlawful behaviour, it risks the safety of workers, it costs the taxpayer, and it means that there is behaviour occurring on our workplaces that simply should not be tolerated. Unfortunately, the present laws have not provided sufficient deterrence to repeated unlawful behaviour of a small number of militant unionists. And what sort of behaviour, members, are we talking about here? Well, the Leader of the Opposition says that John Setka is not a fit and proper person to be a member of the Labor Party. Why does he say that? Because of John Setka's record of law-breaking. What is that record? John Setka has to this point amassed around 59 court convictions for a multitude of offences, including assault police 5 times, assault by kicking 5 times, willful trespass 7 times, resisting arrest 5 times, theft, attempted theft by deception and intent to coerce 9 times, coercion 10 times. These things now, Mr Speaker, finally have formed the basis of a conclusion by the opposition leader that militant unionist John Setka is not a fit and proper person to be a member of the Labor Party. But interestingly, the same remarkable record of offending has not also given rise to a view from the opposition leader that it is not fit and proper for Labor to accept the $1 million that John Setka sent to Labor as a Victorian branch secretary. Likewise, it's remarkable that that criminal record doesn't now appear to be the basis for a view that it was not fit and proper for Labor to accept $13 million from the CFMEU in total. What we have here, Mr Speaker, is a situation where the character of John Setka is now rejected fulsomely by Labor, but his cash is still warmly accepted. As much of it that can flow as possible. And who, Mr Speaker, is actually standing up for workers here? Who is actually on the side of workers? Labor accept $1 million directly from a man they say is not a fit and proper person to be a member of the Labor Party, and at the same time the ABCC has just announced that it has recovered $1 million in underpaid wages for almost 1,400 workers, and following Labor's view, put to them by John Setka, the ABCC.
The member for Oxley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. When will work on the Rockhampton Ring Road commence?
Good question.
And I call the Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, as I said yesterday, work is phased in. When you have a $100 billion infrastructure rollout across this nation, work gets rolled out, Mr Speaker. And what we're not going to do is for when Labor makes election commitments in their own elections, prior to an election, we don't have to meet those particular commitments because Labor didn't win the election. Newsflash, Labor didn't win on May 18, we did. But we are, indeed, rolling out $100 billion of infrastructure right across the nation, Mr Speaker. And when it comes to the member who asked the questions electorate, Mr Speaker, the Ipswich motorway, Brockley to Darra, we're spending $200 million. Urban Congestion Fund, Ipswich motorway, $50 million, Mr Speaker. Financial assistance grants up to $50 million, Mr Speaker. Major projects, business case fund, $25 million. But if the member—
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Minister for Home Affairs will cease interjecting. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
The question was very specific. It's about Rocky. When will it start?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The member for Wright, if he wants to ask a question, he'll have to get on the list, I presume. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. He needs to be relevant to the question, and as I said yesterday, that relates to the subject matter, and I'm prepared to be tolerant, provided he keeps it to the location that the question is asked.
Of course, Mr Speaker, as I hear the opposition leader say, it's not local government, it's also state government. We have to work in conjunction with state governments. Maybe if the Queensland Treasurer's house was somewhere near the road, maybe they might be a little bit more forthright in actually approving these projects and letting us get on with building them.
It's the independence question, and I call the member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Drought. Farmers in my electorate are grappling with the impact of climate change, hotter and drier seasons and more frequent severe weather events. For 2 successive years, we've had hailstorms that have devastated our apple, orchards, leaving our growers desperate for horticulture netting to safeguard against such disasters in the future. Minister, in April 2018, you initiated a national strategy on climate change and agriculture. Minister, will you please advise the House around the content, funding and time frame for this strategy?
The Minister for Drought has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the honourable member for her question? And you are right, in April last year, one of the first achievements after becoming Agriculture Minister at my first ministerial council of all agricultural ministers, state and myself, was to be able to get an agreement on a nationally coordinated approach towards supporting our farmers to a changing and adapting climate. And we were able to, with the support of the Victorian government, I need to acknowledge the former Agriculture Minister there, Jala Pulford, who took the lead on that, commissioned a report that was provided to the last ministerial council meeting in September last year, and the final report will be provided to ministerial council in September this year. So it's important that we get a coordinated approach between state and federal agencies to ensure that we're not duplicating expenditure. But it's also important to understand the work that our farmers and the government has already done, Mr Speaker, particularly since we first put a till in the soil. Our farmers have been adapting to a changing climate, and we are putting over $1.1 billion a year between government and farmers into giving them the tools to be able to adapt to a changing climate, the cutting-edge research and development that they need. It's also important that we continue to improve our landscapes. $1.1 billion has gone into land care itself, a great movement that has changed the land practices of our farmers for the better, not only in terms of environmental outcomes but profitability. And only last night, proudly, this government, as a signature piece to drought policy into the future, was able to pass the Future Drought Fund. $100 million dividend year in, year out. It is legislated, and we will be going out and consulting with the community. What a crazy idea that a government might go out and ask those whose money it is how it should be spent. And it will be looked at things like climate risk, about extension work, about how we can actually ensure our farmers take up the research and development that we've got to better equip them to adapt to a changing climate. That's what a government should be. It should be agile. It should be there to ensure that we deliver money that is purposeful and will be spent properly.
The member for O'Connor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the minister update the House on the government's actions to protect the wages of Australian workers from the actions of militant unions?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. As the member is aware, right now in Australia there is over $2 billion under management in what are known as workers' entitlement funds. Those funds are meant to keep safe and secure money that may in the future be needed to pay for events such as long service leave, sick leave or, very importantly, severance and redundancy payments. There are 9 large workers' entitlement funds in operation, and we described yesterday that one of those funds, known as Protect, transferred just before the last election $32 million worth of workers' money meant to be kept safe and secure for the purposes of future severance payments back to the electrical trade union. There is no rational explanation as to why that occurred. So bad is it that there's a loan facility in case Protect runs out of money to pay for severance payments. They might be able to borrow some back if they ask nicely. It is outrageous. But today there is another example of the complete misappropriation of workers' money from the same severance fund Protect. Now, members, there are a range of enterprise agreements that have a clause that insists and requires that 2% of workers' wages not go to the worker but go to the fund Protect for the purposes of income protection insurance. Now, there's nothing wrong with that on its face. That is money that could be kept in the fund Protect for the income protection insurance of the workers, but it's money that doesn't go into the pocket of the workers, and it's money that they earned. For instance, there's a 2% of payroll clause for income protection for Dubai Port's operations in Australia. And keep in mind these are very large operations, so Dubai Port's payroll in Australia we think is in excess of about $260 million per year. Today in the media it emerges that there is a document which no one has ever seen before, which outlines an agreement between the Electrical Trades Union and Protect under the heading beneficial term, and it is really beneficial, The ETU will receive a benefit from the income protection insurance payments in the amount of approximately 16% of the total fund income insurance contributions. So of those millions of dollars worth of wages year on year that go into the Protect Insurance Fund, 16% of it goes straight back to the Electrical Trades Union. And this government says that in the banking sector a secret commission is deplorable. In this sector it is equally deplorable. This is workers' money that they get no benefit for, that is siphoned off to the ETU. And right now the MUA, part of the militant CFMEU, is pushing very hard for another 2% of wages clause so that the money will flow millions of dollars into this organisation Protect. And what everyone here, and I think the workers would like to know, is there going to be a similar kickback in that arrangement? The only way we will ever know is if this legislation passes to make the relationship transparent.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to the minister's answer yesterday about his declaration. And I refer the minister to the requirement to declare any relevant interest in any shares, whether held directly or indirectly. The minister has not declared his indirect interest in Jamland on his statement of interests. Why?
Member for Chifley. The minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, as I made absolutely clear yesterday, my indirect interest in Jamland, which is part of our family farms, has been widely reported in the media and was declared in accordance with the rules, Mr Speaker. In accordance with the rules, and it is very clear. It is very clear of that interest, and as I say, it has been declared in accordance with the rules. Now, Mr Speaker, to add to that, let me emphasise that I had no association with the compliance.
Could the minister pause for? He's perfectly fine. Again, I need to do this every day. If people on my left keep bellowing into my left ear, I can't be expected to rule on any potential point of order. I'm trying to listen very carefully to what the minister says. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I said yesterday, I had no association, have no association with the compliance action, and I have never made a representation in relation to it, Mr Speaker. But I tell you what I've made representations with respect to the farmers in my electorate, Mr Speaker, the farmers in my electorate. And I note the comment from the member for Eden-Monaro yesterday that the issue wasn't raised with him. And I have to confess I wasn't surprised by it, despite the fact that this listing covers his electorate as much as mine. I wasn't surprised by one bit, Mr Speaker, and I'll tell you why. I know why the farmers of Eden-Monaro aren't raising the issue with their local member, because he doesn't care. His constituents are raising it with me, as are mine. We stand up for farmers on this side of the House. Those opposite simply don't.
Members on both sides. The Minister for Home Affairs.
Mr Speaker, whilst the minister was on his way to the dispatch box, there was an unparliamentary and offensive comment made by the member for Chifley. It was clear for all to hear.
Member for Chifley.
And I would ask you to direct him to withdraw it.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask the minister to stay there. If the minister, I didn't hear the last bit. The member for Chifley, I'm trying to hear a point of order relating to him. He's not going to interject all the way through it. Okay, he just needs to be quiet. Let's start with occasionally. If you could just make the point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Whilst the Minister for Energy was making his way to the dispatch box, there was an unparliamentary and offensive comment made by the member for Chifley. It was clearly heard by many within the chamber. He should have the decency to withdraw it without direction. If he doesn't do so, I'd ask you to direct him to withdraw it.
No, it's a fairly straightforward issue here. I mean, I'll just ask the member for Chifley whether he made an unparliamentary remark. Okay, the member for Chifley will resume his seat. The member for Monash has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the government is ensuring farmers, from Gippy Goat at Yarragon to my many, many dairy farmers who feel under pressure, make sure that they're getting the security they need to grow our nation's food and fibre.
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call. The member for Hunter.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Monash for his question in relation to issues having an effect on regional Australia, having an effect on our farmers, our hard-working farmers, the world's best environmentalists, the world's best land carers. Regional development is important to our farmers. It's important to our government. The member for Monash knows fully well the risk of biosecurity breaches caused by animal activists, criminals, illegally trespassing on farms. They're breaking the law, Mr Speaker. Australian agricultural experts estimate an outbreak of highly contagious animal diseases would cost our agricultural industry up to $16 billion. That's more than a quarter of what the industry's worth. Anyone who intentionally puts one of Australia's most important industries at risk should be thrown in jail for a very, very long time. Now, in the member for Monash's electorate, the Gippy Goat Cafe in Yarragon was invaded by 70 activists. They stole 3 goats from the property. Goodness knows what they did with them. The cafe chose to close with the owners blaming constant harassment by abusive vegan activists. The green-collared criminal who was found guilty— listen to this. The chamber should be quiet to listen to this. The green-collared criminal who was found guilty was fined just $1. Just $1 by the magistrate. Now, that magistrate needs to go back to magistrate school, but this is an outrage. It is an absolute disgrace. Our government has listened to the concerns of
Member for
farmers.
Hunter is now warned.
I can flick it to him if he's that short of cash,
No, you
Mr
can't.
Speaker. And we have acted to secure their properties, to secure their homes and their livelihoods. Their farms are critical and crucial to our nation, and they should be protected. Most Australian farms are family-owned and operated. They're good people. I come from a generational farming family. I know how hard our farmers work. They deserve our respect. If you illegally storm a farm, we will throw the book at you. The new legislation will. Under this, if you're found guilty of using personal information of farmers to incite trespass, you will face up to a year in jail, as you should. And if you go a step further and incite damage or theft on agricultural land, you should be living in a jail cell for the next 5 years. Shouldn't be allowed out in those 5 years, Mr Speaker. We are taking this very, very seriously. And I commend both the Attorney-General and the Minister for Water Resources and Drought, Mr Speaker, for their work in helping to form this legislation. I hear the opposition leaders say it is bipartisan. That is good, as it should be. It's a shame that we had to get you kicking and dragging to actually the Future Drought Fund, but I would also commend the State Minister for Agriculture in New South Wales, Adam Marshall, who's in the House today. This week, the New South Wales government announced $1,000 on-the-spot fines for individuals, further fines up to $220,000 per person and $440,000 for corporations who illegally enter farmers' properties, creating biosecurity risks. Our farmers need protecting. We're doing just that.
Just before I call the member for Port Adelaide, I'm just going to remind the members for Hunter and Moreton to cease interjecting, and the member for Hunter's been warned. The member for Moreton, who I regularly ask to cease interjecting, only to have him agree with me. That's it for the rest of the day. Okay. The member for Chisholm.
My question is.
Oh, sorry. The member for. No. Members on my right. Members on my right, cease interjecting, or I'll give them 2 in a row. The member for Hindmarsh was on his feet. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, and I refer the Minister to his previous answer and to the requirement for members to disclose indirect interests. I have a copy of the Minister's Statement of Interests. Will the Minister confirm it contains no reference whatsoever to Jamland?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
I thank you, Mr Speaker. And as I said a moment ago, my indirect interest in Jamland has been widely reported. In the media, and
Members on my left.
And it was declared in accordance with the rules through my family company. Now, there are many on this
Members
side
on my left.
of the House who have farms. who are part of family farms, and we invest through our family companies. That's how we own our farms. Now, those opposite who have never participated in small businesses or farming wouldn't understand that. They wouldn't understand that for a moment. And Mr. Speaker, this issue has been raised by those opposite as a grubby smear campaign against me and my family. A grubby smear campaign against me and my family. And I can safely say that the work that I have done, the work that I did with respect to the listing that has been referred to in this place in the last 24 hours was to protect the interests of the farmers in my electorate, and they need protection against, most of all, the sort of policies that those opposite brought to the last election.
Well, the minister's concluded his answer. But I'm happy to hear the point of order as always. Yeah.
It's to the dignity of the House. I just want to confirm that there has been, even though it's not reflected in the standing orders, a practice on both sides that we don't question and they don't make allegations about people's families. And I just want to assure the opposition has deliberately not referred to families in any of these questions and will not.
Well, I do thank the Manager of Opposition Business. I'm not quite sure what the point of order was, but I appreciate he wished to make a statement. The member for Chisholm has the call.
My question is to the Treasurer. How will the Morrison government's lower taxes help families and small businesses in my electorate of Chisholm? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternate policies?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the member for Chisholm on her historic victory in bringing that electorate back to the coalition, Mr. Speaker, and the first Chinese-born Australian woman in this place. She has made history, and the Liberal Party has made history, Mr. Speaker. And she brings to this place experience in small business, the type of skills that our members bring to this place in the construction of policy. And she knows that for her electors, people in Box Hill and Box Hill North and people in Glen Waverley, Mr. Speaker, that 71,469 taxpayers in the electorate of Chisholm will be better off as a result of the tax cuts that passed this parliament, Mr. Speaker. And more than 26,000 of them will receive the full $1,080, Mr. Speaker, as a result of the legislation that passed this parliament. And I can inform the House that, as of today, 3.5 million Australians have lodged a tax return for the 18-19 year. That's nearly 25% more than the same period last year. And I can also inform the House that the Australian Tax Office has paid out refunds of $4.1 billion, Mr. Speaker. That's money flowing into the pockets of Australians. And that's money that is flowing into their pockets because this side of the House believes that Australians should earn more and keep more of what they earn, Mr. Speaker. And the legislation that we passed will ensure that Australians will pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar if they earn between $45,000 and $200,000. That is tackling bracket creep, Mr. Speaker. So if you get a promotion, you work a few extra hours, you take a second job, you're not likely to pay a higher marginal rate of tax. And we're abolishing a whole rate of tax, Mr. Speaker. The 37 cents bracket is gone against the wishes of those opposite. And we're lifting the threshold for the 19-cent bracket, Mr. Speaker, from $37,000 today to $45,000. And let me say that those opposite, while we stand for lower taxes, those opposite stand for $387 billion of higher taxes, Mr. Speaker. And the member for Rankin said he was proud and pleased of the retirees and the housing taxes, Mr. Speaker. The member for Barton said that those tax policies they took to the last election were good policies, Mr. Speaker. So no wonder the Leader of the Opposition has not changed his tax policies. He still believes Tax reform means higher taxes for all Australians, so only the Coalition will deliver more money into the pocket of hard-working Australians.
Concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question again is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer the minister to his previous answer. When did the minister tell the Prime Minister that he had an interest in Jamland Pty Ltd?
The Minister for Energy has the call.
Mr Speaker, I have answered the question about the disclosure of my interests before. You need to answer the question as to why you are part of a grubby smear campaign against my family in this parliament and in the New South Wales Parliament, and you are well aware of that. Now, Mr Speaker, as I've said, my indirect interest in that farm in Jamland has been widely reported in the media and was declared in accordance with the rules. And on this side of the House, before we came into the House, many of us were involved in farming and business. That's what many of us did, and the result of that is we have interests in family farms, and that is fully declared through my family company, Mr Speaker, as has been widely reported in the media. Now, Mr Speaker, the reason this issue came up is several years ago, before I was in this current role, several years ago, I sought to ensure that my farmers were being fairly treated in the electorate of Hume, fairly treated under a revised EPBC listing. And that revised EPBC listing was having an impact on and creating concerns with my farmers, which were raised, Mr Speaker, which were raised by the New South Wales Farmers and the National Farmers Federation on several occasions, Mr Speaker. And I read from a letter to the Treasurer at that time, and I quote from the letter, Mr Speaker. At the time the listing was made, the NFF raised the following points in a submission to the Department of Environment. This is a letter to the now Treasurer, the then Minister for Environment and Energy, and the letter goes on to say the information available for public consultation did not provide any quantified assessment of the extent, distribution and the quality of the listing. The information provided as part of the review did not adequately analyse the ongoing risks. And thirdly, Mr Speaker, based on the information provided in the NFF's view, it is highly unlikely that an individual farmer would be able to assess their responsibilities under the EPBC. These were legitimate concerns. They were properly raised in the right context, Mr Speaker, because I stand up for my farmers.
The Manager of Opposition Business seeking to table the document.
Well, I'm asking the minister to table the document that he was reading from. We have a copy of a document that appears to have the same language that was actually months after the meeting, not before it, and not the reason for it.
You're asking the minister to table a document he was reading from.
Yes.
Is the minister quoting from a confidential document? It's a confidential document. I haven't called you yet. If the member for Reg just resume his seat for a second, this might take a minute or so. The Manager of Opposition Business.
I seek leave to table a letter from the then Minister for Environment and Energy, to the then Minister for Environment and Energy from the National Farmers Federation, dated the 3rd of October 2017.
Is leave granted? Leave is not granted. The member for Reid has the call.
My question is to the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure. Will the minister please update the House on the Morrison government's efforts to bust congestion, including the latest developments on the WestConnex project that will benefit motorists across Sydney?
The Minister for Population and Cities.
Well, can I thank the member for Reid for her question and also for her outstanding maiden speech this morning, and we congratulate her on her magnificent victory in the seat in Western Sydney, and her supporters are up here in the gallery today. Well, as the member for Reid knows, 2 weeks ago we reached another incredible milestone of the $16 billion WestConnex project, and that was the opening of the M4 tunnel from Homebush to Haberfield. Now, this 5.5-kilometre tunnel is an absolute game-changer for members, for constituents in the member for Reed's electorate and right across Western Sydney, because what it'll actually do is if a person is driving from Parramatta into the CBD, it now means that they can avoid 22 sets of traffic lights, and it will save them on that journey at 20 minutes going from Parramatta to the CBD. So over the course of the week, if you're doing that daily, that's 3.5 hours of time that you are saving every single week. 3.5 hours that you can spend with your family, with your other loved ones, on the sporting field or doing things that you want to do rather than being stuck in traffic. Mr Speaker, this is an absolute congestion-busting project at its best, making a real difference to thousands of people's lives on a daily basis. But what's more, Mr Speaker, it also has a great economic impact, because when you clear some of the traffic, like is happening on Parramatta Road, like also by able to make that 20-minute make that journey 20 minutes faster, it's better for tradies, it's better for the trucks who are distributing goods around, and so overall it's better for the economy. There was also 4,000 jobs that were while constructing the project, 16,000 jobs overall during the construction of the WestConnex project. So it's a great congestion-busting project. It's great for the economy. And given these fantastic attributes, I'm both disappointed but also astounded that the Labor Party, the opposition, is still so against the WestConnex project. In fact, just a few years ago, the Leader of the Opposition, when he was the Transport spokesperson, said that he didn't support this project because, and I quote, "It's a road to nowhere." A road to nowhere. Parramatta's a road to nowhere.
You know a lot about that.
And furthermore, he said that if I'm the Transport Minister, there will not be a single dollar going into this project. There will not be a single dollar. So I can tell you what, Mr Speaker, we don't believe that Western Sydney is nowhere. We're on the side of those residents in Western Sydney who want to be able to get through traffic more quickly. We're building infrastructure in Western Sydney to make it easier for them to get home sooner and safer, and we're on the side of all Australians who want to bust
the
congestion,
Minister's time
improve
has
the
concluded.
economy, and get home sooner and safer.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emission Reduction. I refer the Minister to his claim he did not ask for a compliance officer from the Department of the Environment and Energy to be present at his grasslands meeting, and his confirmation a compliance officer was there. If it wasn't his idea to have a compliance officer there, whose was it? Did the Treasurer ever advise the Minister that the compliance officer was present at the request of the Treasurer?
The Minister for the Minister for Energy. Sorry.
Well, Mr Speaker, the department determines who comes to these meetings. And let me be very clear. I didn't ask for, or indeed even know, that a compliance officer was present at the meeting.
The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is empowering communities to protect and preserve their own local environments?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Robertson for her outstanding representation when it comes to local conservation volunteers. She is a fabulous advocate for the Central Coast, and you only have to visit to see her, sleeves rolled up, not sitting behind a computer making lofty statements, out there with her people working hard. She has secured $600,000 of funding. She's secured $600,000 of funding through the Environment Restoration Fund already, and that's for cleaning up waterways, coastlines, removing litter, protecting threatened species. And I'd like to talk today, if members opposite would allow me, about a new fund, the Communities Environment Program, open to all members of the House, up to $150,000 per electorate. And I'm not sure whether members opposite would like to participate, but they're invited. Their local groups can apply for grants of up to $20,000 for projects just like this, repairing riparian areas, working hard with your volunteer groups, working with your land care groups. Caring for the environment is a shared responsibility. and our community groups are the ones we rely on. We can't do it without them. They deliver excellent projects across the vast and amazing landscape of rural and urban Australia. The program guidelines will be out soon. There'll be information sessions, again for members opposite as well as members on this side of the House next week. We look forward to you promoting this program amongst your constituents, stepping up and understanding that the government is on the side of conservation volunteers, on the side of Australians who want to take practical action to protect our environment and to preserve its precious features.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. At the meeting to which the minister has previously referred, did he ask for the grasslands listing affecting jam land to be varied without scientific advice and then kept secret? Was that the minister's idea or the Treasurer's?
The Minister for Energy.
Look, Mr Speaker, I make absolutely no apology for seeking and receiving briefing on policies that affect the farmers in my electorate.
Members on my left.
In my electorate. And I am a proud farmer in my electorate, and I will always seek and receive briefings on policies that impact them, Mr Speaker, that impact them.
The member for Flynn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Regional Services, Decentralisation and Local Government. Will the minister update the House on how the government is delivering on its commitment to create jobs, boost the economy and the productivity, improve digital connectivity and support drought-affected farmers and communities in regional Australia? Thank you.
The Minister for Regional Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Flynn for his question. I know how important regional connectivity is to him and his electorate. This government is committed to supporting Australians through adversity, and the member would know, as well as the challenges being faced by many communities across Australia. We're focused on delivering better connectivity for the people in our communities to grow their businesses, employ more people, stay connected with family and friends, and respond to emergency situations. I can confirm that the base station in Maroondah, in the southern end of the member for Flynn's electorate, was recently switched on to provide improved coverage for the communities in the area, such as Gingin.
Member for McMahon.
This tower is further evidence of the member for Flynn's record of delivery for his constituents, with 22 base stations now reducing black spots in his electorate. It's also evidence of this government's continued and wide-ranging support to drought-affected communities like Gingin through the infrastructure investment throughout the community. As well as direct financial support, these communities need a way to communicate, share stories and be connected to the services they need. It is thanks to the government's $380 million mobile black spot program that more regions like Maroondah are being provided with better mobile coverage. The member for Page and his constituents that also know the benefits of the mobile black spot program is providing, with the tower at York Lee, just near Casino, switched on only this week. The record investment has funded 1,047 towers across all corners of the country, with more than 740 already on air and delivering their coverage. With a base station in his electorate turned on just yesterday, the member for Wide Bay, as a former police officer, would be pleased to know that having these towers on air has enabled more than 25,000 OOO calls to be made. More towers make more of these life-saving calls possible. And we're not done yet, Mr Speaker. Round 5 of the program is currently open so we can continue to forge ahead with our commitment to improve rural connectivity. We're committed to providing these who choose and live in the businesses, choose and run businesses in these regions the same coverage as their city counterparts. That's why the Liberal and National Government is building new phone towers across the country, and while those on the other side have built none. And I might say, Mr Deputy Speaker, there's been some talk on the other side about dates and timeframes. I'd like to give the members opposite a date and a time frame. How about we try February 2008? And I know what the view's like from that side of the chamber because I was sitting there. It was the week I made my first speech in parliament. It was also the week that the legislation was introduced to remove the $2.4 billion black spot infrastructure.
Member for Cowan. The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. On Tuesday, the minister said, and I quote, "I have always disclosed my interests and I've been very clear about those interests." When did the minister relinquish his interests in the Cayman Islands?
The Minister for Energy has the call. No, just the minister will just take a seat. The Leader of the House.
I'm failing to see how that has anything to do with the minister's portfolio.
No, actually, I think that the Leader of the House has made a reasonable point. As I heard the question, it simply asked when did he relinquish his interest in the Cayman Islands. I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, the final paragraph is exactly as you've described. The paragraph before that refers specifically to the answer he gave on Tuesday and is therefore inquiring with respect to that.
No, members on my right. Members on my right are not helping. As I heard the question, and I'm happy to hear it again, it referred to an earlier answer, but then just asked a question about when did he relinquish his interests. I'll hear it again and then I'll make a ruling. Member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emission Reduction. On Tuesday, the minister said, and I quote, "I've always disclosed my interests and I've been very clear about those interests." When did the minister relinquish his interests in the Cayman Islands?
No, I'm going to rule that out of order. The member for Canning.
Speaker, my question is for the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister update the House on Australia's strong and consistent border security measures, and is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that would put those border security measures at risk?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. As all Australians know, under the Labor Party, 50,000 people arrived on more than 800 boats and at least 1,200 people drowned at sea. And shamefully, 8,000 children were put into detention by Labor. There was nothing humane about Labor's border protection policies, and, Mr Speaker, we know that under Labor's policies it resulted in a record 2,453 people in detention, and we've brought that offshore cohort down from almost 2,500 under Labor to 740, and we're reducing it as quickly as we can down to zero. We've been able to negotiate third-country resettlement options, including with the US, and 585 people have departed, Mr Speaker, as at the 18th of July to go to the United States, and others have received provisional approval and are in the process of their pre-departure arrangements. We want to make sure, Mr Speaker, that the people smugglers hear a consistent message, because this government is on the side of Australians who want strong border protection policies to make sure that we can decide who comes to our country and the way in which they can be screened before they arrive. It's a very important point, Mr Speaker. There are biosecurity issues, there are identity issues in the modern age. The thought that somebody can turn up to our country without a passport or without identity documents in the 21st century is simply inconceivable. And the reality is that we have been consistent from day one in relation to border protection matters, Mr Speaker. We've been able to stand up to the people smugglers, but there is a very significant departure now between the two positions, the position of the government in contrast to the position of the Labor Party. We know that during the course of this last election, only in May of this year, that vessels had already departed in anticipation of a Labor government being elected. Mr Speaker, there were 41 people on a boat on their way to Australia anticipating a Labor government, and the Labor Party had, just before the election, decided to introduce a very dangerous bill called the Medevac Law, which again sent the wrong message to Sri Lanka, to Indonesia and elsewhere. They have been all over the place for years now when it comes to border protection policy. This Leader of the Opposition is trying to be as sneaky as the last Leader of the Opposition. He's trying to pretend to the Australian people that he's on their side when it comes to border protection policies, but of course he is not, Mr Speaker. The Australian public's worked out Labor. They know that Labor remains weak on border protection policies, and they know that if Labor was ever re-elected, the boats would restart and kids would be back in detention.
Concluded. The member for Griffith.
My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, and I refer to his previous answer. Did the minister's meeting with departmental officials discuss any of the following matters?
Could I just ask that? There's just a couple of interjections there, and I'm just struggling to hear the member for Griffith anyway. If I could just ask the member for Griffith to start again. Yeah, a bit louder would be good. I know that's unusual for me to ask anyone to speak louder, but just for 30 seconds, okay?
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emission Reduction, and I refer to his previous answer. Did the minister's meeting with departmental officials discuss any of the following matters later referenced in departmental correspondence about the Threatened Species Scientific Committee? Whether the Environment Minister could vary the listing without the committee's advice, whether the minister could act against the committee's advice, and if the minister acted against the committee's advice, could the minister keep the reasons secret?
The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the briefing was a technical briefing with respect to a revised listing of the EPBC, which had the potential to impact thousands of farmers in my electorate, their livelihoods, their well-being.
The member for Warringah.
Speaker, my question is for the Prime Minister. Businesses in Warringah are bound by Australian consumer law. In particular, they're not allowed to mislead and deceive customers about their products or services. Yet, in contrast, it's a free-for-all in political advertising during campaigns, where misleading and outright false claims are made by all sides of politics, resulting in a loss of trust in our political system and undermining of our democracy. Will the government introduce or support legislation for a minimum standard of truth in political advertising during political campaigns?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Warringah for her question. She would be aware that the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters undertakes a review of all matters in relation to the conduct of the most recent election, and it will bring forward a report, and that will be considered by, indeed, the government and the parliament, and that is the appropriate place for those matters to be addressed and to be considered as they come before this parliament. But I would agree with the member for Warringah that the activities by GetUp in the most recent election and the actions they took against the former member for Warringah was some of the grubbiest and some of the most despicable actions I've seen by what is indeed a political organisation masquerading as something independent, Mr Speaker. And the actions that GetUp took against the former member for Warringah and that was stood up to by the member for Boothby. And I commend the member for Boothby for staring down the bullying that was done by GetUp to her at the last election, and also, Mr Speaker, to the member for Dixon, the member for Kooyong, Mr Speaker, and they're all here again, and I'm so pleased to see them here again, Mr Speaker, because the Liberal Party and the National Party will never be intimidated by the bullying tactics and the big union money that goes into GetUp and the Labor Party.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on further action the government has taken this week to deliver on its priorities?
The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left. Members on my left will cease interjecting, or I'll start ejecting. The member for McMahon is warned.
He got a
Prime
warning at the
Minister has
last
the
election, Mr Speaker, the member for McMahon.
They haven't heeded it.
They haven't listened to it though, Mr Speaker. They got a big warning from the election. At the last election, they said they didn't want higher taxes, Mr Speaker, and they didn't want the Labor Party. But I thank the member for Wentworth for his question, Mr Speaker, and I couldn't be more pleased to see the member for Wentworth sitting on these benches, Mr Speaker, and I commend him for his outstanding maiden speech to the parliament last night. It's been a big week this week, Mr Speaker. We've talked a lot about the impact of thuggish unions and their impact on trying to thieve workers' wages. And, Mr Speaker, we know a lot about the union movement coming here and trying to kick down doors in Parliament House, as we saw back there in 1996. But this week we had a Labor state member of Parliament come down and try and kick down the door of a hotel room, Mr Speaker. That's the sort of behaviour they think's okay in the Labor Party, and we're seeing that. We are seeing that in the same way. Oh.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. Members on my right, the Minister for Drought, the Minister for Health, the Minister for Health. Just refer you to what I said yesterday. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, I accept with a question like that it is really hard to not be relevant. Like, the question was as broad as it could possibly be.
Certainly was.
And
no, members on my right.
And the Prime Minister has managed to not be relevant to the question.
I think the Prime Minister has almost concluded his preamble, but I would say to those on my left, I'm certainly not going to intervene, just so I'm really clear. If there's going to be a wall of interjections as the Prime Minister stands up to answer it, I'm going to allow him and ministers to answer those, as I've done in the past. So if you lead with your chin, you'll just sort of better be ready to deal with it. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, this week in the Parliament, once again, our government demonstrated whose side we're on. And it was very clear whose side the Labor Party was on, Mr Speaker. When it came to the issue of the drought fund on Monday, what we did is come in here and stood up for farmers, and the Labor Party had to be dragged kicking and screaming, Mr Speaker, to actually support Australian farmers through the establishment of the drought fund. Back from last October, when at the Drought Summit, which brought together state and territory leaders and people from all around the country, this is one of the key actions, and I'm so pleased that this week we've been able to get the result and be able to legislate this drought fund, which is part of a $7 billion response by this government to the drought, backing in Australian farmers and rural communities and graziers all around the country. Mr Speaker, on top of that, we took action just like we did a couple of weeks ago when we took legislation through this parliament to provide tax relief to all Australians through a comprehensive plan, which again the Labor Party showed they are not on this side of aspirational Australians who want to keep more of what they earn. They had to be dragged kicking and screaming, whereas on this side of the House we know what we want to do. We want to provide tax relief to hard-working Australians, and we want to keep Australians safe. That's why we brought legislation into this parliament that deals with the risk presented by foreign fighters. Now, this is something we have been consistent on, Mr Speaker, as a government, to keep Australians safe, and we have taken action on this to ensure that we can keep Australians safe in the face of the threat of foreign fighters. And, Mr Speaker, we've taken action this week as we bring legislation into this House to ensure that dodgy unions, Mr Speaker, militant unions, cannot thieve the earnings of workers in this country, that they cannot go and set up these dodgy funds and siphon off the earnings off to their mates in all sorts of union funds, which ends up in the campaign funds.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. That the House calls on the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction to immediately make a statement to the House for a period not exceeding 20 minutes, explaining 1. Why he met with the Department of the Environment and Energy officials in the office of the then Minister for the Environment and Energy and now Treasurer in March 2017 to discuss the listing of a critically endangered grasslands while the department was investigating the alleged poisoning of the same grasslands on land he part-owned. 2. why and how an officer from the compliance unit of the department responsible for the investigation was present at the March 2017 meeting. 3. Why, following the meeting, the Office of the then Minister for Environment and Energy asked for advice on whether he could vary the relevant listing without the advice of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, whether he could act against the committee's advice, and whether he could keep the reasons for the variation secret. 4. Why, despite stating that his interest in Jamland Proprietary Limited was declared in accordance with the rules, he has failed to list his indirect interest in Jamland Proprietary Limited on his member's statement of registrable interests. 5. What declarations, if any, the Minister has made to the Department of the Environment and Energy, the Office of the then Minister for Environment and Energy and the Prime Minister about his interest in land subject to a compliance investigation by the Department of the Environment and Energy, and 6. How his conduct is consistent with the Statement of Ministerial Standards.
Is leave granted? Thank the Leader of the House. Leave is not granted. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. I move that so much of the standing orders be suspended as would be necessary, as would prevent the Manager of Opposition Business from moving the following motion immediately. That the House calls on the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction to immediately make a statement to the House for a period not exceeding 20 minutes, explaining 1. Why he met with the Department of Environment and Energy officials and the Office of the then Minister for the Environment and Energy and now Treasurer in March 2017 to discuss the listing of critically endangered grasslands while the department was investigating the alleged poisoning of the same grasslands on land he part-owned. 2. Why and how an officer from the compliance unit of the department responsible for the investigation was present at the March 2017 meeting. 3. Why, following the meeting, the Office of the then Minister for Environment and Energy asked for advice on whether he could vary the relevant listing without the advice of the Threatened Species Scientific Committee, whether he could act against the committee's advice, and whether he could keep the reasons for the variation secret. 4. Why, despite stating that his interest in Jamland Proprietary Limited was declared in accordance with the rules, he has failed to list his indirect interest in Jamland Proprietary Limited on his member's statement of registrable interests. 5. What declarations, if any, the Minister has made to the Department of the Environment and Energy, the Office of the then Minister for the Environment and Energy and the Prime Minister about his interest in the land subject to a compliance investigation by the Department of the Environment and Energy, and 6. How his conduct is consistent with the Statement of Ministerial Standards. I bet he loved butlers before he got to this parliament.
The Manager of Opposition Business resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Heard.
I've just called the Leader of the House.
I move that the member no longer be heard.
Question is the Manager of Opposition Business be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. If the ayes have it, division required. Ring the bells for 4 minutes. Lock the doors. Order. The question is the manager of opposition business be no further heard. The ayes will pass to the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Gray and Nichols tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 69. The question's therefore resolved in the affirmative. Is the motion seconded? The member for Griffith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I second the motion. The minister is going to have to come clean eventually. He should just do so now.
Seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I move that the member no longer be heard.
Question is the member for Griffith be no further heard. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute. Members must remain in their seats. I appoint the same tellers as the previous division. Members must remain in their seats unless they're leaving the chamber, did not vote in the previous division, or they're changing their vote, in which case they must report to the tellers. Lock the doors. Question is that the member for Griffith be no further heard. As this is a successive division, members must remain in their seats unless they're changing their votes or did not vote in the previous division, in which case they must report to the tellers. Order. The result of the division is ayes 74, noes 69. The question's therefore resolved in the affirmative. The question now is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the noes have it. Division required. Ring the bells for 1 minute, but the tellers will do a full count. Lock the doors. Order. The question is that the motion moved by the Manager of Opposition Business be agreed to. The ayes will pass the right of the chair, the noes to the left. I appoint the honourable members for Lawler and Werriwa tellers for the ayes, and the honourable members for Nichols and Gray tellers for the noes. Order. The result of the division is ayes 66, noes 74. The question is therefore resolved in the negative. The Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and as members depart just on indulgence, can I commend and congratulate all the new members who gave their first speeches in the House this week, but could I particularly extend to the member for Dunkley all the best wishes of the House.
I thank the Prime Minister.